This evening is, our guys are going to each take turns, and the rule is that each one of them is going to take about 10 minutes and do a presentation for you, and that sounds a little bit funny because honestly, I've been in the same room with Bob Stannard, and it took him 10 minutes to tell me one joke. Yeah. And Davy Donuts is a little bit the same way. And Terry Tyler goes without saying. So first of all, I think what we're going to do is Dave Quesnel will be our first presenter, and I'm going to read a little bio about him. And then as we move along to the next one, we'll do the same thing. So let's hear a little bit about Dave. Dave was born in Middlebury and has spent his entire life living in Vermont. Are we still there? Okay, thanks, Jim.
Get used to that microphone, would you please?
I got it.
All right, if it cuts out the heat side.
You know, this guy that keeps running his mouth's the same age as my brother Greg, born the same day, same hospital. So I feel like I'm...
Your brother, actually.
Oh, God help me. The only difference is I still have hair and he doesn't. You got a good beard, though, and I don't.
I know.
Okay, Dave. He has hiked the length of Vermont, biked the length of Vermont, and has visited every town in Vermont. As he embarks on his 7th decade, he has no plans to leave now. As typical of Vermonters, he has made a living performing a variety of jobs. Among other things, he has been a baker, hence Davy Donuts, a builder, and a bartender. He has made maple syrup, milked cows, and put up hay. Dave has spent much of his life in Vermont woods, hiking, hunting, fishing, trapping, and snowshoeing. His attempts at golf had him in the woods more than in the fairways. I think he wrote this. It was while growing up on a dirt road and spending his days in the nearby woods that he developed his appreciation for our Vermont landscapes and its people. David lives in Manchester with his wife, Paula, who has spent way too much time dropping him off at trailheads, retrieving him from mountaintops, and listening to his endless supply of stories. Of his book, Grandpa's Memoirs, Growing Up on a Dirt Road, Carrie McLaury, librarian at Wilder Memorial Library in Weston, says, Quesnel's stories are light, funny, and nostalgic, and as they follow his life through the woods, cow ponds, and many roads of rural Vermont, and Sandra Levesque, executive director of the 251 Club of Vermont, noted, what you choose to share in the book was truly evocative of a time and oh so rich with homespun details. So Dave.
That's all about me?
Thank you. I think Jim, when he was talking about those rules as a family tradition in our house, those are suggested guidelines. Suggested guidelines. Anyway, first of all, I'd like to thank you for having me. I'm both flattered and honored to be here at this wonderful facility. Thanks to a lot of dedicated and committed people, Manchester has added yet another gem that is second to none. Libraries are essential to our small towns. My book took flight in the basement of the Wilder Memorial Library in Weston. Also, right behind those doors over there is my writing studio. This is the first time in my life that the letter Q let me come up to bat first. Actually, Bob and Terry think that I'm just here to warm up for them. Bob has mentioned that two of us are funny. Terry and I think Bob's funny sometimes too. And yes, I did write a book about growing up on that dirt road in the 50s. Things were different then, but 60 years from now, things will be also different. So I'll just start from the beginning. Growing up in the early 1950s on a dirt road in Whiting, Vermont, about a mile from the paved road, provided me with many fond memories. We lived in a little house that accommodated 8 people connected to each other with one common mission: survival. I never realized we were poor until long after we'd moved to Middlebury when I was about 9 years old. Oh, how I resisted and hated the idea of leaving my beloved surroundings and outdoor playground. Every day, with my brothers John and Larry, I was outside in the nearby woods and meadows without parental concern. Yeah, my mom, Aunt Jess, and my grandfather knew every word, sort of what we were doing, but all they required of us was to stay within hollering distance. That's how we were summoned for lunch or supper and at bedtime. We had a small barn that housed a milk cow and a handful of chickens. We usually raised a hog or two, which provided us great entertainment when you tried to ride them. And we also raised some sheep. We had a good-sized garden and a couple of prolific cherry trees, the likes of which I have never seen again. Cherries up the yin-yang. As my friend Bill Herrick wrote a long time ago in this poem, remembering when. Give me a farm at apple time, new mown hay, cherry wine. Give me an oak or a fence to climb, stones to kick, summer shine. Give me the air that reeks of hay, cows to milk, a baseball day. Give me a creek, a boyhood chum, holidays, sweets, a ripened plum. Give me a fire in mama's hand, soil that shines the greening land. And give me the girl by the apple cart, May blossoms an untried heart. Oh, what I would give to live again, those days we call remember when. Also, I think it was kind of neat during that period of time and way back then that I got to go to a one-room schoolhouse. And I'll share a little bit about that one-room schoolhouse now. In that one-room schoolhouse, there were 4 rows of 3 of 4 of those little combination, there were 4 rows of 3 or 4 of those little combination desks that had a seat with no arm on one side to place the desktop in front of you. Under the desktop, there was a shallow tray for pencils, erasers, and paper, and school stuff. You accessed it by lifting up the hinged desktop. There was also some storage under the seat. Each row represented a school year. Row 1, first grade. Row 2, second grade. Mrs. Webster would stand in front of a row and teach that grade for a while, and then she would move over a row and teach that grade. If she posed a question to, let's say, the 4th grade, and nobody came up with the answer, I could, from the 2nd grade, raise my hand and offer an answer. For the most part, we got along okay, but Mrs. Webster had the audacity to talk sometimes while I was talking. She'd get grouchy and not only tell me to stop talking, but should I choose to ignore her, she'd maybe go sit in the corner. I'd have to sit on this stupid stool and face the corner. She never did let me finish my story, not once. I guess nowadays this might be called a timeout. Well, actually, go sit in the corner has evolved to this. Go sit in the corner. Please go sit in the corner. Never mind, I'll sit in the corner for you. I'm sorry I asked you to go sit in the corner. And I'll share another little story with you about playing out in those woods and having a lot of fun, and we always had some interesting things to do, but this little story always stands out in my mind. It's called the Blue Milk Pitcher. And I'm not sure why this milk pitcher is so vividly stamped in my memories of Whiting, but I have a very clear recollection of it. Being on the counter next to the kitchen sink to be filled from the milk pail, on the kitchen table being passed around during a meal or snack time, in the refrigerator waiting for me at breakfast. I'd get up before my siblings so I could skim the cream from the top of that blue milk pitcher to have with my cereal. Let them have the skim milk that was left. Get it? Where do you suppose we got that term skim milk? We didn't bother with percent amounts. I'm not sure what caused an almost full pitcher of milk to be tipped over on the kitchen table as we finished supper one night, but there it lay on its side with the milk slowly draining across that faded red and white checkered oilcloth onto the well-worn wooden floor. All of the ladies of the house called out in unison, "Dad, come mop up the milk." With some grumbling and sputtering, my grandfather Ted appeared with a mop and pail. He did not enjoy being called to duty by the women. As he was making this last swath along the floor, he noticed the spilled milk on the kitchen table and deftly took his final swath with that filthy mop across the table. Ted! They all hollered together again and also gave him some additional reprimanding. But I don't think Grandpa ever had to do chores again inside the house. And this started, I'll start you in the beginning, and 50 years later, I got to grow up with a grandson in Middlebury, and we spent a lot of time walking and talking around Middlebury and sharing stories of me growing up in Middlebury. And here's the conclusion of this book with a little chat and a walk with that little boy who's here somewhere. When Jack first moved to Middlebury back in 1999, we spent a lot of time walking around town. We'd walk to the hockey games at Middlebury College, something we still do today, and he's now in his 20s, through St. Mary's Cemetery, where he showed me the mummy's gravestone. When Z showed me the fossils on the stone bridge over Otter Creek, I asked him how old they were. He thought for a moment, then said, "They're pretty old, maybe as old as you." I have been called a fossil, I guess, I would say that. We walked through the pulp mill bridge, on the railroad tracks, across Otter Creek on the footbridge where the boathouse used to be. The boathouse probably fell down because my cousins Dick, Larry, Tom, Bugger, and I pumped about 1 million rounds of 22 shells into it. Zach and I got to know each other quite well, and we had many wonderful conversations about my childhood while I was growing up in Middlebury. And I'm thinking about Zach's childhood, growing up in Middlebury with the full support of doting parents, along with a bunch of grandparents and aunts and uncles. By the time he was 14, he had been on 2 Disney cruises that included commercial flying. I was about 40 before Paul and I took our first commercial flight across the country to visit my son David in San Diego. On this particular night, we're walking home from a hockey game, and I was telling him how much I had the freedom of roaming around Middlebury all day by myself. He stopped me right in my tracks and told me I was the luckiest kid alive. I agree. Thank you. Thank you.
There. Thank you, Dave. That was great.
Thank you.
Makes me feel like we all should write a book at some point, you know, about our lives and our past. It's fun to do this. Okay, our next presenter, Mr. Storyteller himself, is Bob Stannard, and I'll give you a little info about Bob. Bob is an 8th-generation Vermonter who has served in the legislature, worked as a logger, a lobbyist, a columnist for 2 papers, and a commercial real estate broker. He retired from a 30-year career in Vermont politics to play music, write, and enjoy his family. He has been married to Allison Stannard since 1973. They have 2 grown children and 4 grandchildren who now rule his life. Bob has been a performing artist playing and singing the blues since 1969. He says, "I have been a musician for as long as I can remember." He's had the privilege to play with 2 kings, B.B. King and Stephen King, as well as some of the nation's most important musicians. He's recorded 3 albums and is the author of 2 Vermont humor books, How to Survive the Recession, A Vermont Perspective, and the follow-up, How to Survive the Recovery, A Vermont Perspective. Both books were illustrated by nationally acclaimed syndicated cartoonist Jeff Danziger. According to Governor Peter Shumlin, Bob Stannard's wit is as sharp as ever. He uses a hilarious mix of old-time Yankee common sense with some everyday Vermont images of buckshot in the behind and hanging by a nose. Bob's book guarantees a good read and a hearty laugh. So, Bob, it's your turn.
just in case. We'll just set that right there, and all else fails, we can fall back on playing. Many thanks to the utterly insane Cindy Waters for thinking this was a good idea. The three of us are sitting up here fairly perplexed. I said to Terry earlier, I looked at this room and I said, if we charged $2 a piece to get in, there'd be 5 people here. But I want to thank you all for coming to this event. It's free, and don't hesitate to support the library when that time comes up. As was duly noted by one of the Comars, Jimmy Comar, all three of us are really, really funny. So in that light, I'm going to actually, I was told to read from my book. And I said, okay, we have the, we have and, but I probably should read words in succession, I guess. My first book was called How to Survive the Recession, A Vermont Perspective. The key words in the title are a Vermont perspective. There's nothing in this book that will help you survive the recession. Conversely, the same is true of my new book, How to Survive the Recovery. It is a collection of, oddly enough, real things that happened to me in my life. So if you read this book, you think, wow, what a misspent life that guy had. I'm glad I've got a chance to see him for free. Quickly, as to how to survive the recession, I took a quote from David Henry Sterry, and it reads, "One expected benefit of the worst economic depression in a century is that for the first time in history, poor people are happier than rich people. Experts claim this is because the lifestyle of poor people barely changed with the economic downturn. They were already below the poverty level before, and they're below the poverty level now. Bingo. That's all you need to know." That's the first book. Now, this book is a lot more detailed, I think. Oh, I should thank what's his name? Jeff Dangzinger for doing the artwork in my book. You'd be surprised how it helps the sale of your book to have somebody that other people know. Is there anybody in the room that remembers a man from Dorset named Dave Baker? Look at that one. Oh, look at the hands. All 5 of you. Good. Well, and again, now what we're talking about here is how to survive the recovery. And the theory behind my book is that if you can survive events that have happened in Vermont, surviving an economic recovery is a no-brainer. There's a little store in Vermont in a town called Dorset. It's known as the Union Store, the Dorset Union Store. Nobody in the town calls it by that name because the locals have known it as Pelcher's Market forever. It was started by a man named Perry Pelcher, and he was a quiet guy. He used to wear those little armbands that butchers would wear to keep their sleeves of their starched white shirt from falling into the bloody gook of cutting up meat. The store oozes yesterday. The floors lost their luster long ago, and that's a good thing. Today, the place is a little more upscale than it once was, but then again, what isn't really? By the late 1970s, the store was purchased by my old friend, the late Jay Hathaway. With the help from some local investors, Jay bought it from Perry, and Jay ran the place very well, somewhat different from Perry, but he did a nice job. There were a great cast of characters who they were around back then, not the least of which was Dorset's retired garbage man, David Baker. Dave did a lot of different things. Actually, he could be seen as a role model for young people today. I don't think he had much in the way of a formal education, which was probably a good thing. A formal education probably would have just held him back in so many ways. No, but he was an A student in life. It's fair to say that just about everything Dave ever learned of any value he learned from fishing. Now, this may not make much sense to you folks, but then again, you're the one who lost your butt in the Great Recession, so you'd be well served to listen up. Although it'd be hard to prove, I think Dave, unlike you, had the first dollar he ever made right up until the day he died. Anyway, about fishing and recessions and recoveries. If you don't fish, you should start doing so today. Well, when I wrote this, not that day because it was 0 and you'd freeze to death. But today would be a good day to start fishing. And don't get yourself one of those fancy fly rods and $10,000 worth of gear. What you need is, part of the reason you went in the hole to begin with is you spent all your money on stuff like that you didn't really need. All you really need is a cheap rod, some worms, and some beer, some time, and some patience. I might suggest that you copy that last line down and print it out and hang it on your wall so you can read it every day. Those few things will keep you out of just about any fiscal trouble imaginable, with the possible exception of the beer. Notice I said some beer, not all the beer on the shelf. After knowing Dave my entire life, he was the garbage man after all, and it wasn't like we had 2 garbage men in Dorset, right? We just had the one. I finally got an invitation from Dave to go fishing. Now, this may not sound like much to you, but it would be the equivalent of getting a phone call from the president's office asking if you want to come over for some soup. Suffice it to say, it was about the biggest deal of my life at the time. We got out to the Metairie River late in the day, and frankly, I thought it was a little early, and so did Dave, and I said so, and he replied, well, if you do it right, it don't matter what time of day it is. Well, I had to ponder that for a while. I was an enthusiastic fisherman, but my record of bringing home strings of fish, as my dear bride Allison will contest to, was dismal. Dave said, go ahead and bait your hook and toss it in right over there underneath that hanging branch, but don't get hung up in the branch. Well, that's good advice. It's near impossible, but it was good advice. I grabbed the biggest worm I could find, and I jabbed the hook in, and I twisted it and twisted it again and twisted it again, and I can feel you all wincing out there, the poor worm. But if you can't deal with that, you're going to have trouble recovering, by the way. I bunched my worm up and ran the hook through a second and third time. No way that her worm was coming off my hook. Dave looks at me and says, so you catch a lot of fish baiting your hook that way? Well, yeah, some. Oh, well, that's pretty good. I never had much luck catching fish baiting my hook that way. You must be a pretty good fisherman. Okay, so now I'm trying to crawl into my boots. The fact is I wasn't very good, and my pride was a tough thing to overcome. I asked Dave how he baited his hook. Well, first thing I do is look for a smaller worm, and then I place the tip of the hook right on the very end of the worm and just thread it on there nice and neat and just let it lay nice and flat. That's the best way to catch fish. Okay, and he says it's also easier on the worm. So now, not only am I a lousy fisherman, I'm also a worm torturer. Great. So I baited my hook just like Dave showed me. He's about 30 feet away, downstream, and he casts, and I'm not catching, I won't use the right word in here, but anything. He had 2 fish in about 3 minutes. I looked to see if I'd had a bite. He had another fish. And I figured it like this. Some guys are babe magnets. Doesn't matter what they do, women just want them. I think it was the same with Dave and trout. After a while, I wonder if he even bothered to bait his hook. Hell, the fish would just jump right out of the water and into his creel. All he had to do was sit there with a beer and not even be bothered by the fish at all. Well, as you might have guessed, a little more to it than just baiting the hook. But anyway, so Dave's long gone now, and about once a year I go back to that place and just kind of remember him. So now let's get back to Pelcher's Market, because I'm probably running out of time. I'm sure I am. So Dave, in my eyes, was one of the calmest, least excitable characters I've ever known. Often wondered that you could like set his pant leg on fire and he'd probably just dust it off. It wouldn't bother him. The day in question was a lovely midsummer morning. It was one of those days that you can tell right off it's going to be hot by 2 o'clock. It was a good idea to get to work early before the sun burns you to a crisp. I was mowing lawns back then. Probably young Brad Tyler was working for me. I'd like to say with me, because I always felt I worked for Brad. My days generally began with a quick stop at Pelcher's for a coffee before we went off to mow 20 lawns. Today was no different. I walked into Pelcher's, and I could see Jay in the back cutting meat, minus the armbands. Times change. I poured a cup of coffee and I said good morning to Jay. 7 a.m. Pelcher's Market is a busy time, and there are already people getting their paper and the few items needed for the day. What happened next happened very, very quickly. I said goodbye to Jay. I turned around to face the door going out. Well, actually, there's only one door in and out at Pelcher's Market, so I faced the door. Is that for me? Would you please tell them I'm busy? If anybody has a cell phone, would you please all turn them on? Not on vibrate, but really loud. That way, you wouldn't have to listen to me. Where the hell was I? So I said hello to Jay. I turned around and said goodbye to Jay. I'm walking out. There was this well-heeled lady with an armload of stuff about 12 feet away. And she was about halfway between me and the only door at Pelcher's Market, Dorset Union Store. And through the dusty, dirty glass door, I could see Dave Baker putting his hand on the time-worn handle. He pushed the door open and placed his left foot inside the store. At that exact same moment, Miss Wellhill screamed at the top of her lungs, scaring the living, well, you know, out of everyone in the store. It wasn't just a regular scream, no, it was more like that scream that Donald Sutherland had at the end of Invasion of the Body Snatchers kind of scream. No one had any idea what the heck it was that sent her off, no one except Dave the garbage man. In an instant that lasted an eternity, Dave looked in the face of the shrieking lady. He could instantly tell that her eyes were fixed on the floor. His eyes shot down to the floor as well, where he saw a most frantic mouse darting back and forth. The mouse presumably was equally as startled as everyone else in the store based on the way he was running around. Without any thought, planning, or contemplation, Dave put his right foot in the store. On his right foot, he donned a monster work boot that he probably bought at H.M. Williams' department store and slammed his right foot down on the floor. Bang. Unfortunately for the mouse, or anyone else who happened to witness this massacre, he happened to be dead center under Dave's boot. Dave then picked his left foot up and placed it in front of his right foot, taking a full second step into the door. Miss Wellhill had the same look in her face as the lady who would sit next to you the first time she saw the shower scene in Psycho. You could have parked a small car in her gaping mouth. Eyes straight ahead, void of any expression, Dave took his next step, the moment most of us had been waiting for. As his right foot came up, we could see what was left of the poor, unfortunate mouse. It was about as thick as a bicycle playing card. There was a giant splotch on the floor that seemed like an extraordinary size for the fact that the mouse wasn't all that big. Could all of that come from that tiny little mouse? Guess so. Anyways, Miss Wellhill had all she could do to keep from throwing up, and notwithstanding the fact that we're all in a little bit of a state of shock, had all we could do to keep from bursting out with loud laughter. Now, don't get me wrong, we weren't all that overjoyed with the demise of poor Stuart Little, mind you. But we were all pretty much enjoyed the cool, calm, and relaxed way David the garbage man quickly assessed and then disposed of what one lady perceived as an emergency situation. Dave never broke his stride. He just kept walking like nothing ever happened. There was never the scream from hell. There'd never been a mouse. He was just walking in to get a cup of coffee, just like we all did every day around 7 o'clock at Pelcher's Market. It was just another day for Dave.
Good job. That was good. That was good. Nicely done.
Thank you.
Boy, that goes without saying, doesn't it? Thanks a lot,
I don't know
Bob.
I said it.
I know you did. I still have a vision of that
I never had
mouse.
to play either. Phew.
That was good.
Last but certainly not least is our third storyteller, Terry Tyler. And I'd like to tell a few words about you, Terry.
Oh, boy.
Terry was christened Nathaniel, a fine old biblical name wasted on a dirty old man.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Who wrote this?
His educational background is indeed dismal. He drifted in and out of elementary and secondary schools, from a one-room school in North Rupert to Burton, leaving in his wake a phalanx of emotionally wrecked educators and administrators. It is known that he attended the University of Maine for 2 years and that neither benefited from the encounter. Mr. Tyler has a lovely, long-suffering wife, Helen, whose only character flaw emerged 59 years ago when she committed matrimony with him. Anything to say, Helen? Terry has supported his hobbies over the years with a small electrical contracting and security system business by hiring highly skilled electricians to earn his living for him. Mr. Tyler not only created the illusion locally that he was a good businessman, but by the fruit of their labors, he has raised his family out of squalor and financed his delving into libraries and historical archives.
I don't think you have to speak, just let him read that.
As he became eligible for Social Security, he suckered his younger son into buying the marginally solvent business, enabling him to glorify his laziness by rechristening it as retirement.
Oh, Jesus.
Who do you suppose wrote this? Terry will share stories from his trilogy of books, Don't Scratch Too Deep, The Profane History of a Vermont Valley, illustrated by the celebrated A.D. Reed. We knew him as Sandy. Senator Fred Eric stated, "Worth waiting for and worth every penny." And Ann August added, "Thank you for writing an unsanitized history of Dorset." So what else do we say here but to invite our next storyteller guy up here with his microphone. Come on by.
Introduction's worth it, right?
He was a friend. I want to thank Cindy for getting me into this, and thank my wife of almost 60 years of putting up with what we've got here. And if you're wondering where that laughter came from, I brought my own claque with me. She's dressed like a traffic cone, right? Anyway.
Oh my God.
I was told to limit this to 10 minutes, and we'll live with it, even though Mr. Stannard seemed to be above the restriction. Now it's my turn, Mr. Comer. The Quality Restaurant opened in 1920 and was the favorite eating place in this valley for over 50 years. Its owners and operators were Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Comer, his grandparents, who were immortalized by Norman Rockwell. Morning coffee hour was celebrated by most businessmen at the family table, which could seat 10 or 12, 6 to a side. One warm summer morning, George Roberts, who owned a garage opposite the stone bandstand that used to be just north on Main Street, ordered a glass of iced tea and immediately discovered that the Comer's son and heir, his father, Pete, had forsaken his mother's delicious brewed tea for the instant variety. George's yowl of protest still echoes in Manchester. God, Pete, pour this back in the horse.
Another frequenter of the quality was Sammy Greenberg, a giant of a man who some say was put on this earth to ruffle feathers. Sam loved ham and eggs, which was a no-no in his strict upbringing. Early one morning, he plunged himself down opposite Nornie Roberts, no relation to George, and ordered his favorite breakfast. Nornie had just finished his meal, but delayed his departure for his work at the Aquanic Country Club. As his plate was placed in front of him, Sam looked up. Coming through the door was his father, Israel, a firm believer in the tenets of their religion. Before the senior Greenberg got close enough to see what his wayward son was preparing to consume, Sammy pushed his delight in front of Nornie. The patriarch of the Greenberg clan hovered over and visited with his son as the hero of Aquanic Country Club devoured the entire plateful. Later, young Roberts said he would have finished that free meal if it had gagged him, and was delighted in the knowledge that Sammy would end up paying for 2 meals. Another Manchester resident, back in 1950, Dr. Clifford Harwood of Manchester called Dr. Don Bashaw, who was Dorset's resident physician at that time. It seemed that a family up the Meadowy Valley was desirous of committing a confused aging relative to the Brattleboro retreat. Back then, the state evidently required the signatures of 2 doctors as well as a relative to commit. Dr. Harwood asked Dr. Bashaw if he would join him in this mission of mercy. Don said he had a 4 o'clock appointment, and if Cliff would pick him up at 4:30, they could go together. At the specified time, the 2 doctors aboard Cliff's conveyance proceeded up Route 30 and shortly came up behind Monty Baker, driving his horse-drawn 4-wheel wagon. The highway north of Dorset, as I'm sure some of you know, is a series of hills and curves, and caution dictated that they would not try to pass. As they idled along behind the slower vehicle, Dr. Harwood remarked, "Poor Monty, he has the worst case of piles I've ever seen." To which observation Don replied, "God, Cliff, I wish I had your eyesight." You're using up my time here. About 3 a.m. one summer morning, Tuck Nichols, who was I promised I wouldn't use bad language here, so he was a relative of my wife's, was dropped off at his South Dorset residence by Jim Miller after the pair had spent their evening imbibing in the bars of Granville's infamous Alley. As he felt his way to the back door of his home, Tuck observed that his garden, enclosed by a 6-foot chicken wire fence, had been violated. A fat doe was standing in the moonlight with a pea vine hanging from her mouth. With murder in his heart, Tuck quietly entered his home, picked up his .32 special Winchester, and climbed the stairs to his bedroom, opened the eyebrow window facing the garden, and touched off 1 shot, dropping the intruder where she stood. He quickly dragged his quarry from the garden, which he shared with Emmett Woods, and took it to his barn, dressed the beast, split her in half, shouldered 1/2, and crossed Route 30 to the Woods home, climbed the porch steps, entered the kitchen, and dropped his burden, blood and all, on the kitchen table. He then stepped to the bottom of the stairs and hollered, "Emmett, here's your beets and carrots." This is all true. One autumn Friday, I was picking up some conduit fittings. This is before we had PVC conduit, and it all had to be threaded in, and you'll see. To pick some conduit fittings from the Stannard Company, and passing an hour of swapping stories with the founder of that plumbing empire, John Stannard Sr. As we stood in his front yard adjacent to Route 30, along came Walt on the seat of his horse-powered wagon. "Whoa," said the teamster who greeted us both. "Where you headed?" asked John. "I'm going to Bonneville Fair," replied the traveler with a bottle protruding from his coat pocket. "Have a good time," we chorused as our friends started in a southerly direction. The following Monday morning dawned cold and rainy, and I returned to Stannard's for a forgotten fitting when we heard the clip-clop of hooves. There was Walt, looking a trifle soggy and kicking some empty bottles around at his feet. "Whoa," he shouted. "How was the fair?" John queried. The reply was brutally honest. "I don't know, John. I never found it." It was a somewhat less than perfect November day at John Kelleher's funeral at East Dorset's Catholic Church. After the service, we stood in a cold, drizzling rain at the graveside for the committal. As the small crowd was dispersing, the priest, obviously not a conservative, spake these exact words of comfort to John's widow. "He's better off where he is, Katie, than with 4 more years of Nixon." You like that one, huh? Wait till you hear what he says about Shumlin. All of the Connors family of North Dorset are rugged individuals and are seldom bested in any confrontation, be it physical or conversational. While on an errand on a sizzling hot day in Albany, New York, George Sr. made a sudden lane change, and at the next red light, an irate woman screamed at him through the open window of her car, "Do all you Vermonters drive like jackasses?" George's rejoinder was swift and sure. "Yes, ma'am, and we're hung like 'em, too." Well, it gets better, fans.
Oh, boy.
One evening, a small group of us were playing pitch in Ed Tarbell's store across from the Dorset Inn when Mary Jones came through the door, visibly shaken and babbling about that damn dead Twires. She had a way of putting it. Our storekeeper, ever sympathetic, asked about her consternation. "Well, Eddie," she explained, "I was hiking up the Dudway from Manchester, and Ed offered me a ride in his dump truck." Mr. Tarbell consoled the lady thus. "Why, that was nice of him, Mary. God damn it, Eddie, once we got going, he started to get fresh with me." Mary was about 60 some odd at this point, but so was Ed. The proprietor offered, "My goodness, Mary, if you didn't like it, why didn't you get out?" Her answer left us in tears. "Well, I sure would have, Eddie, but I got my boomerang caught in the shifting river." I don't laugh at this. An elderly farmer in bib overalls stood at the counter of the Factory Point National Bank in Manchester Center. Peggy Bryant, a veteran cashier, had just finished a transaction with him, and he stood to one side, counting and recounting the cash that she had handed him. Chet Andrews, the newly elected president of the bank, was observing this performance unfolding in his domain. Chet approached the customer, introduced himself, and asked the farmer if he could be of service. "Nope," was the reply. Chet persisted and asked, "Has the teller given you the right amount of cash?" His answer was pure Vermont, "Just barely." I remember a remark made by Harry Davis, a distant relative of my wife and a real old conservative. I met him at the Dorset post office a mite over 60 years ago. He had heard of my engagement to Helen and offered this observation: I hear tell you're going to forsake single blessedness for double cussedness. One more, fans, and you can have at somebody else. Our grandson, Michael, Brad's son, at age 12, had successfully passed the Vermont State Hunter Safety Course and had been issued a deer license. On a brisk November day, he went hunting with his father, who was unarmed, as it was Youth Day when adults are not allowed to hunt. About 6 hours after the first light, he dragged a beautiful 6-point buck down off Lockwood's Ridge and onto our front lawn. His father and grandfather were understandably proud, and a crowd consisting of his grandmother and many friends were congratulating the young hunter when a passing pickup truck screeched to a halt, spinning the tires. It backed up to enter our driveway. Ricky McNulty leapt out and asked Mike if he had shot that deer. Upon hearing that indeed he had, Ricky shook Mike's hand, patted him on the back, and turned to Brad and said, "Now we gotta get him laid." Michael's grandmother was not pleased. Thank you. Hey, we had a good time.